What if the famous Neanderthal face was never a strange Ice Age mutation at all, but part of a much older human anatomy that already existed long before the Out of Africa story claimed modern humans evolved from tall, gracile runners on the savannah? Indeed, something does not quite fit anymore. And the strange part is that the people still defending the old picture of human origins often speak as if nothing has changed. The public still hears the same story that emerged out of the middle 20th century, a story built around the idea that Neanderthals represented a bizarre, cold-adapted side branch that evolved in brutal Ice Age isolation somewhere deep in western Eurasia, while modern humans supposedly emerged as gracile, warm-weather, long-distance runners in sub-Saharan Africa before sweeping outward and replacing everybody else. Yet when the actual anatomy is placed side by side, when the skulls are measured instead of mythologized, and when the new anatomical studies are examined carefully, the entire distinction begins to dissolve into something far more complicated and far more uncomfortable for the old model. A recent cranio-cervical analysis of Neanderthals did not simply discuss noses. It quietly dismantled one of the oldest assumptions in paleoanthropology, the assumption that the Neanderthal face represented some uniquely Ice Age adaptation disconnected from the anatomy of earlier African humans. Suddenly, the famous projecting Neanderthal face no longer looked like an isolated evolutionary experiment. Instead, it looked like part of a larger anatomical system tied to posture, neck strength, jaw mechanics, respiration and cranial orientation, traits that appear repeatedly across ancient human populations, extending well beyond Europe. The new analysis described the Neanderthal skull and neck as a deeply integrated structure, almost like a single mechanical unit shaped by immense physical stress and body mass. Their cervical vertebrae appear broad and powerful, their neck posture more rigid than living humans, their cranial base angled differently, their jaws displaced forward, and their faces pulled outward into the famous mid-facial projection that generations of scientists portrayed as bizarre and primitive. Yet the paper quietly acknowledged something deeply important. These traits did not emerge suddenly in classic Neanderthals. They appeared gradually across earlier Middle Pleistocene populations. That statement changes everything, because once those earlier populations are examined honestly, the illusion of a clean separation between African and Eurasian anatomy begins to collapse. Take Bodo from Ethiopia, one of the largest and most imposing human skulls ever uncovered from Africa. The face is massive, the brow ridges are enormous, the cranial architecture is thick and mechanically powerful. Nobody looking at Bodo honestly could describe that anatomy as gracile, delicate, or marathon adapted. Yet Bodo lived in Eastern Africa, not glacial Europe. Bodo did not evolve in freezing tundra, stalking woolly mammoths through snowstorms. The old explanation for Neanderthal facial projection depended almost entirely upon cold adaptation, the idea that massive nasal cavities and projecting faces existed to warm icy air before it entered the lungs. But if similar facial massiveness and cranial architecture already existed in African populations living in warm climates, then the entire explanation begins to look incomplete. Suddenly, the famous Neanderthal face stops looking uniquely northern and starts looking deeply ancient. What becomes even more uncomfortable for the traditional out-of-Africa picture is that Eastern African fossils continue producing anatomy that scholars themselves describe as Neanderthal-like. The Halabi material from Ethiopia, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, contains traits openly compared with Neanderthal morphology, despite appearing inside Africa itself. This creates a serious problem for the simplistic narrative that divided the world into archaic northern brutes and gracile southern moderns. If Neanderthal-associated anatomy keeps appearing inside Africa, and if large, robust cranial forms dominate the African fossil record well into the late Middle Pleistocene, then where exactly is the supposed homeland of the early gracile modern human body plan that older theories promised would appear? That question hangs over the entire debate like a shadow nobody wants to address directly. The original out-of-Africa model depended heavily upon expectation. Scientists believe that if modern humans emerged recently inside sub-Saharan Africa, then the fossil sequence there would eventually reveal progressively earlier gracile modern skeletons leading toward living people. The expectation sounded reasonable at the time because the earliest gracile modern humans known from Eurasia already extended beyond 100,000 years ago at Skul and Kafse in the Levant. If those populations came from Africa shortly beforehand, then older and even more anatomically modern populations should exist farther south. Yet decade after decade, the fossil record stubbornly refused to cooperate. What if the entire image of ancient Africans as thin, gracile endurance runners never came from the African fossil record at all, but from anthropologists sitting inside London museums, men who had never truly experienced the vast biological diversity of Africa, projecting simplistic stereotypes onto an entire continent, while the actual fossils from places like Bodo, Kabwe and Ngaloba showed enormous, powerful humans who looked nothing like the textbook fantasy. Instead of lightly built runners racing across savannah grasslands, the African record repeatedly produced enormous, thick-boned humans with broad faces, heavy jaws, and robust skeletons. Bodo, Kabwe, Ngaloba. Even many later Eastern African skeletons display strong muscle attachments and thick cortical bone, unlike the gracile Mediterranean populations traditionally associated with early Homo sapiens in the Levant. The uncomfortable truth is that the earliest clearly gracile human skeletons often cluster around the eastern Mediterranean rather than deep tropical Africa. Skul, Kafse and related populations display body proportions and cranial architecture remarkably close to later Eurasian humans, while numerous African fossils remain large, rugged and structurally powerful. The old endurance running hypothesis only deepens the contradiction. According to that popular narrative, humans supposedly evolved gracile bodies through persistence hunting on open savannas, running antelope to exhaustion beneath the African sun. Yet the archaeological evidence from Africa tells a very different story. Ancient African populations hunted gigantic and extremely dangerous animals, including hippos, buffalo, giant bovids, crocodiles and elephants. Hippos alone kill enormous numbers of people even now. These animals do not reward lightweight gracility. They reward coordination, strength, thrusting power, group tactics and courage during close-range encounters. The archaeological evidence from Africa does not portray endless marathon runners floating effortlessly across grasslands. It portrays highly dangerous confrontations between heavily armed humans and massive prey animals in wetlands, lakeshores, forests and river valleys. Even the famous aquatic and riverine environments connected with several Eastern African fossil sites undermine the simplistic running narrative. Many important human fossils from Ethiopia, Kenya and Tanzania derive from lake margins, marshes and river systems rich in dangerous megafauna. The people living there exploited fish, turtles, hippos, water birds and large mammals gathering around permanent water. This ecological setting resembles the broad-spectrum hunting and ambush behavior associated with many Eurasian populations far more than the old image of elegant distance runners chasing gazelles across empty plains. In reality, heavily built humans make perfect sense in these environments. What makes the Levant especially important is that it sits directly between Africa and Eurasia. Yet older models often treated it almost like a temporary hallway rather than a genuine evolutionary center. The gracile humans from Skul and Kafse possessed modern-looking anatomy over 100,000 years ago. They buried their dead. They used ochre. They gathered shells. Their body proportions appear relatively slender compared with many African Middle Pleistocene skeletons. Meanwhile, nearby populations connected with Neanderthal anatomy occupied overlapping territories through different climatic phases. Instead of two separate species isolated on opposite continents, the fossil record begins to resemble a fluctuating network of connected populations around the Mediterranean and Near East. The new craniocervical study indirectly reinforces this broader picture because it frames Neanderthal anatomy as an integrated body system rather than a random pile of isolated features. The neck, skull base, jaw orientation, facial projection, airway structure and posture all interacted together. That matters enormously because similar integrated systems appear repeatedly across ancient human groups. Once anatomy is viewed mechanically instead of ideologically, the rigid categories begin to weaken. Robustness exists on a spectrum. Facial projection exists on a spectrum. Cranial elongation exists on a spectrum. Thick bone exists on a spectrum. The sharp dividing line between Neanderthal and early modern human becomes increasingly difficult to defend. Ironically, many of the same scholars who once insisted Neanderthals represented a totally separate species now openly discuss repeated interbreeding, shared behaviors, overlapping technology, and even possible cognitive similarities. Ancient DNA shattered the old replacement fantasy years ago, yet some anatomical arguments remain trapped in an earlier intellectual era. The public still inherits museum displays and textbook imagery rooted in assumptions from the early 20th century, assumptions built when Neanderthals were portrayed almost like ape-like cave creatures. Even now, many discussions quietly preserve that emotional separation despite overwhelming evidence of biological continuity. The obsession with the Neanderthal nose perfectly captures this problem. Earlier explanations treated the projecting face almost like an exotic adaptation unique to Ice Age Europe. Yet projecting faces occur across many ancient human groups. Large nasal apertures occur repeatedly. Massive jaws and brow ridges occur repeatedly. Once robust African fossils enter the comparison honestly, the uniqueness begins evaporating. Bodo especially becomes impossible to ignore because the skull carries enormous facial dimensions despite existing in warm Eastern Africa. If a huge projecting face automatically signified cold adaptation, then Bodo should never have existed. The deeper issue hiding beneath the anatomy concerns chronology itself. The earliest accepted modern humans in Eurasia already extend beyond 100,000 years ago, and some disputed material pushes even earlier. Meanwhile, the African record remains highly fragmented, geographically uneven, and anatomically mixed. Some fossils appear surprisingly archaic late in time. Others combine modern and ancient traits. Others possess enormous cranial size and facial massiveness inconsistent with the image of a tiny, gracile, founding population. The neat evolutionary ladder that older theories expected simply never appeared. Instead, the evidence points toward a broad, interconnected human landscape extending from Africa into the Levant and across Eurasia, with populations repeatedly mixing, separating, adapting and reconnecting through changing climates. During wetter periods, corridors opened across Arabia and the eastern Mediterranean. During harsher periods, populations fragmented into refugees. Traits accumulated unevenly. Some groups became more robust, others became more gracile. Some retained projecting faces, while others developed flatter facial architecture. But none of this resembles the old cartoon version of one tiny African population suddenly inventing modern humanity before replacing everybody else. Even the language surrounding Neanderthals often reveals how outdated many assumptions remain. The term archaic still carries emotional weight, even though many so-called archaic populations possessed cranial capacities equal to or larger than living humans, controlled fire, hunted cooperatively, buried the dead, manufactured adhesives, shaped wooden tools, processed pigments, and survived across extremely demanding climates. The growing evidence of interbreeding destroys the emotional barrier entirely because successful fertile mixing means these populations were biologically far closer than earlier scholars wanted to admit. The study becomes important precisely because it reframes Neanderthal anatomy as functional rather than monstrous. Their projecting face emerged from biomechanical relationships involving posture, respiration, jaw orientation, cervical integration, and cranial architecture. In other words, the famous Neanderthal face was not some random primitive leftover. It formed part of a coherent human body plan. Once that realization sinks in, the old museum image of the Neanderthal as a fundamentally different being begins fading away. What if the real story never involved separate species battling for dominance at all? What if the human story across Africa and Eurasia involved structured populations within a wider interconnected lineage, populations adapting locally while still exchanging genes over enormous spans of time? The fossil evidence increasingly leans in that direction. Ancient DNA leans in that direction. Morphological overlap leans in that direction. Even the supposed unique Neanderthal face now leans in that direction. The strongest contradiction remains Africa itself. The old model expected ancient gracile humans deep in sub-Saharan Africa long before similar anatomy appeared elsewhere. Yet after generations of excavation, the record still produces overwhelmingly robust humans across large portions of the continent. Some of the most physically imposing human fossils anywhere on Earth come from Africa. Massive jaws, thick skulls, broad faces, huge muscle attachments. These people were not delicate persistence runners, drifting harmlessly across open grasslands. They hunted giant prey, survived dangerous environments, and possessed bodies shaped by immense physical demands. Meanwhile, the Levantine populations often appear strikingly more gracile, despite existing far closer to Neanderthal territory. That contradiction sits at the heart of the entire debate, because it suggests that gracility did not emerge from some isolated southern African marathon culture at all. Instead, it points toward a more complicated demographic system centered around the eastern Mediterranean, Arabia, and connected refuges extending into northeastern Africa. Even climate models reinforce this interconnected picture. During humid phases, the Sahara transformed into a patchwork of rivers, lakes, and grasslands, linking populations across huge distances. The Mediterranean coastlines shifted repeatedly. Arabia contained freshwater systems and habitable corridors. Human populations moved back and forth across these regions many times. The notion of a permanently isolated sub-Saharan cradle becomes increasingly difficult to sustain against the environmental evidence itself. There's another uncomfortable reality hidden inside the body proportions. True gracility often appears associated with warmer Mediterranean and coastal environments, rich in stable resources rather than brutal open savanna endurance lifestyles. Coastal populations exploiting fish, shellfish, birds, and smaller game do not require gigantic, robust bodies designed for close-range encounters with megafauna. The Levantine corridor fits this pattern remarkably well. So do several Mediterranean-associated populations later in time. The anatomy aligns more naturally with mixed ecological systems than with the old endurance-running mythology. The persistence of the old narrative partly reflects institutional inertia. Entire generations built careers around a sharp division between Neanderthals and modern humans. Entire educational systems simplified human origins into clean branching diagrams, easy for the public to understand. Yet reality rarely behaves so neatly. The fossil record resembles a tangled web more than a ladder. Some African populations resemble Eurasian forms. Some Eurasian populations retain ancient African features. Some Levantine humans appear startlingly modern early in time. Some late African fossils appear astonishingly robust. Once all the evidence enters the picture simultaneously, the old categories stop holding together cleanly. The irony is that the new studies meant to explain Neanderthal uniqueness increasingly reveal continuity instead. The studies sought to understand the famous projecting Neanderthal face, yet its broader implication cuts in the opposite direction. By treating the skull, neck, airway, jaw, and posture as a unified system, it showed that Neanderthal anatomy evolved gradually through earlier populations rather than appearing suddenly as an isolated anomaly. And once those earlier populations are examined honestly, Africa itself becomes part of the same story. That realization changes how ancient humans should be imagined. Instead of isolated species evolving separately in sealed continental boxes, the evidence points toward shifting human networks linked across Africa, the Levant, Arabia, and Eurasia through recurring expansions and contractions driven by climate. Some populations became more robust, others became more gracile. Some retained projecting faces, others flattened. Yet all belong to a broader evolving human lineage, exchanging genes and anatomy across vast stretches of time. The famous Neanderthal nose therefore becomes something far more interesting than an Ice Age curiosity. It becomes evidence against the simplistic categories imposed upon the fossil record during an earlier era of anthropology. Once robust African fossils like Bodo enter the conversation honestly, Once Ethiopian fossils carrying Neanderthal-like traits are acknowledged, once Levantine gracile humans older than 100,000 years ago are taken seriously, and once the failure to uncover ancient gracile populations deep in sub-Saharan Africa is admitted openly, the old picture begins falling apart piece by piece. And perhaps that explains why the debate remains so emotionally charged. Human origins never concern bones alone. They concern identity, narrative, and the need for simple beginnings. Yet the deeper scientists dig into the middle Pleistocene, the stranger the picture becomes. The borders separating Neanderthal from modern human blur. Africa and Eurasia stop looking isolated. Ancient humans stop fitting into neat categories. The old story grows unstable. The real mystery now is not why Neanderthals possess projecting faces. The real mystery is why so many people still cling to models built before ancient DNA, before integrated anatomical studies, before the growing realization that robust, ancient humans existed across enormous regions of the old world simultaneously. Something larger connected these populations. The anatomy itself points toward that conclusion. Thank you for watching. If this subject fascinates you, continue digging into the fossil record yourself, because the deeper one looks into ancient human anatomy, the harder it becomes to maintain the clean divisions and simple migration stories still repeated in popular culture. The bones tell a far stranger story, one involving connected populations, shifting climates, repeated mixing, and ancient humans who looked far more alike than earlier theories ever admitted. And somewhere inside that tangled human past, beneath the projecting Neanderthal face and the massive African skulls, the older picture of human origins quietly begins to fade away.